The crystal chandeliers at the gala were blinding, but they weren't nearly as sharp as the venom in Sarah's voice. She leaned in, her designer heels clicking against the marble as she looked me up and down with practiced disdain. "Planning to live off Mark's genius forever, Casey!" She sneered loud enough for the entire department to hear. "Maybe it's time to get a real job instead of just being a pretty accessory on his arm." A suffocating silence fell over the circle. I looked at Mark, the man I was supposed to marry in 3 months. I waited for him to defend my honor, to tell them I was more than he could ever deserve. Instead, he just took a slow sip of his champagne and offered a small, patronizing smile. He didn't say a word. He let the humiliation hang in the air like a thick, foul smoke, enjoying the fact that I was being put in my place. They thought they knew who I was. They saw a quiet fiancé who stayed home while Mark saved the company. Nah, they had no idea that while they were playing corporate politics, I was the silent architect behind the very systems they relied on to breathe. If you've ever been underestimated, silenced, or treated like you're invisible by the people who should value you most, stay tuned. Because what happened the next morning when I walked into their headquarters didn't just shatter Mark's ego, it exposed a fraud so deep it will leave you breathless. This isn't just a story about a woman who got even. It's about a masterpiece of revenge that no one saw coming. By the time I was finished, the laughter didn't just stop, it turned into terror. My name is Casey, and at 52, I have spent 3 decades mastering the invisible architecture of the digital world as a senior IT operations manager, a role that requires one to be the calmest person in a room full of burning servers. I moved to this city 5 years ago for a fresh start, bringing with me a reputation for solving the unsolvable and a personal philosophy that the most powerful person in the room is often the one who listens the most. When I met Mark, a charismatic executive at a mid-sized tech firm, I thought I had finally found a partner who appreciated the quiet strength I had cultivated over a lifetime of corporate warfare. The gala was held at the Grand Sterling, a venue designed to make everyone inside feel like they belonged to a higher caste of humanity. The air was heavy with the scent of expensive lilies and the metallic tang of chilled champagne, a combination that usually signaled a night of hollow networking. I stood by Mark's side, draped in a navy silk gown that was elegant yet intentionally understated, playing the role he had requested of me for months, the supportive, quiet fiancé who was taking a well-deserved break from the stresses of the world. For the past year, I had allowed Mark to tell his coworkers that I was enjoying a sabbatical, a vague term he used to mask my high-level consulting work. I didn't mind the privacy at first, but as we stood in a circle of his senior colleagues, I realized the narrative had shifted into something far more toxic. Sarah, a senior account manager known for her sharp tongue and sharper ambitions, swirled her glass and fixed her gaze on me with a look of practiced pity. She was 20 years my junior and wore her arrogance like a badge of office. The conversation had been centering on the firm's recent software struggles problems I knew the solution to within 5 minutes of hearing them described, but Sarah decided to pivot the focus toward me. She let out a dry, theatrical sigh and tilted her head. "I'm so curious, Casey. Do you ever get bored just waiting for Mark to come home? It must be a dream to live off his genius forever. But don't you worry about your brain turning to mush. I mean, shouldn't a woman get a real job, even if it's just to keep busy?" A stifled wave of laughter rippled through the group. I felt the weight of a dozen gazes, most of them filled with the kind of condescension reserved for women they deemed past their expiration date. It was a look I had seen many times in my career, the assumption that because I wasn't loud, I wasn't capable. I didn't flinch. I felt my pulse remain steady, my years of managing high-stakes crises kicking into gear. I turned my head slightly to look at Mark, expecting him to laugh it off and mention the 3 certifications I held, or the fact that I had managed budgets larger than his entire company's valuation. Instead, Mark didn't even look at me. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his champagne, a faint, patronizing smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He offered Sarah a playful shrug that felt like a betrayal in physical form. "She's happy where she is, Sarah," he said, his voice dripping with a kindness that was actually a weapon. "Casey has earned her rest. Besides, she's much better at making our home a sanctuary than navigating the shark tank we live in." It was a calculated performance. In that single sentence, he hadn't just failed to defend me. He had actively validated Sarah's insult. He was publicly defining me as a domestic accessory, a small, fragile thing that needed his protection and his paycheck to survive. The betrayal hit me not as a heat, but as a profound, icy clarity. I realized in that moment that Mark didn't just love me. He loved the power he felt by keeping me under him. By letting Sarah belittle me, he was inflating his own status as the sole provider, the brilliant mind, and the benevolent husband-to-be. He was gatekeeping my identity carefully, curating a version of me that was non-threatening to his ego. He wanted the world to see a trophy that didn't talk back someone who made him look successful without ever overshadowing his light. It was a strategy of erasure, a social cage he had been building bar by bar since our first date. The group continued to chuckle, Sarah looking particularly triumphant as she sipped her drink, convinced she had successfully marked her territory. I remained perfectly poised, my face a mask of serene indifference. I didn't defend my career, and I didn't show the anger that was beginning to crystallize into a plan deep within my chest. I knew something they didn't when people believe they have already won. They stop looking for traps. They become careless. They speak too freely. As I stood there nodding gracefully to a comment about the catering, I was already documenting the power dynamics of the room. I noted who Sarah's allies were. I observed the nervous twitch in the CTO's hand when the software crash was mentioned, and I felt the growing gap between the man Mark pretended to be and the man he actually was. Mark squeezed my waist, a gesture that was meant to look affectionate but felt like a claim of ownership. He leaned in and whispered that we should go find the CEO, his breath smelling of expensive grapes and a cheap sense of victory. I followed him, my heels clicking rhythmically against the marble, a sound that felt like a countdown. He thought he was leading me through his world, showing me off like a prize he had tamed. He had no idea that I had spent the last 20 minutes performing a full diagnostic on his professional life and his character, and the results were failing. He truly believed he had secured his future at my expense, unaware that the quiet woman at his side was already recalculating the variables of our entire relationship. That smile wasn't a mistake. It was a cage. He thought he had locked me in, but he forgot that I'm the one who designed the locks. The morning after the gala, the silence in our house felt heavy, though Mark didn't seem to notice. He kissed my cheek before leaving for work, humming a tune, and looking every bit the confident executive, entirely unaware that the woman he had patronized at dinner was already miles ahead of him. Once the door clicked shut, the facade of the stay-at-home fiancé vanished. I didn't head for the kitchen or the laundry room. I walked into the small windowless guest room at the end of the hall, a space Mark rarely entered, and dismissively called my craft room. Inside, hidden behind a locked door and a sophisticated firewall, was the nerve center of my true life. This was the headquarters of my independent consulting firm, a high-stakes sanctuary where I operated as a ghost. My desk was a command station of multiple monitors, each glowing with the heartbeat of global networks. I sat down, the familiar hum of high-end cooling fans greeting me like an old friend, and immediately transitioned into the person I had spent 30 years becoming the fixer. To my clients, I wasn't a 52-year-old woman with a mushy brain. I was the surgical general they called when their digital empires were on the verge of collapse. While the world slept or drank champagne, I was the one who diagnosed the fatal fractures in their systems and quietly stitched them back together. I didn't need the spotlight, and I certainly didn't need the validation of people like Sarah. In this room, my authority was absolute and my skill was undeniable. As I began my morning routine, clearing a critical bottleneck for a bank in Singapore and neutralizing a breach for a logistics firm in London, I reflected on the strange armor I had discovered in my 50s. In my younger years, I had fought tooth and nail for a seat at the table, constantly proving my worth. In a male-dominated industry that looked at my gender before my credentials. But as I aged, I noticed a shift. Society and men like Mark, in particular, began to look past me. I became a background character in their narratives, someone to be managed or cared for rather than feared or respected. At first, it stung, but then I realized the immense tactical advantage of being underestimated. It was a superpower of invisibility. When people assume you are incapable, they stop guarding their secrets. They talk too loudly in hallways, they leave their screens unlocked, and they reveal their deepest insecurities because they don't think you are smart enough to understand the implications. I had spent the last 2 years using this invisibility to build my own firm in total secrecy. I had moved my personal assets into accounts Mark couldn't touch and built a reputation under a corporate pseudonym that was now synonymous with elite crisis management. I kept my success quiet because it protected my peace, but also because I had seen the flash of narcissism in Mark's eyes early on. I knew that if he found out I was more successful than him, he would either try to take credit for it or find a way to dismantle it. So I let him believe he was the sun in our universe while I quietly mapped out the stars. The transition from the gala's humiliation to the cold precision of my work was seamless. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a predator. I had spent years watching men like Mark climb ladders they didn't build, using the labor of women they didn't value. I had documented every ego-driven mistake he made, not out of malice, but out of a habit of risk assessment. I knew his company was struggling because I had seen the stress lines around his eyes for months, even if he tried to hide them behind a mask of bravado. He would come home and brag about his genius new system, and I would listen nodding as he explained concepts I had mastered decades ago, all while noticing the glaring logical fallacies in his descriptions. I knew his system was a house of cards, but I hadn't realized how close it was to the edge until my encrypted inbox chimed with a Priority 1 alert. The message came from a top-tier cybersecurity firm that often subcontracted my most specialized auditing services. They were desperate. A mid-sized tech company was experiencing catastrophic system instability and a potential data leak that threatened their upcoming public offering. The board of directors was bypassing internal management to bring in an outside expert who could provide an unbiased, brutal assessment of the failure. I clicked on the attached dossier, my eyes scanning the corporate profile. My breath hitched as the familiar blue and silver logo filled the screen. It was Mark's company. The revolutionary system he had been touting as his masterpiece was currently hemorrhaging data and paralyzing their operations. According to the internal reports, the management team, specifically the department Mark led, was claiming the crash was a freak accident, an act of God that no one could have predicted. But the board suspected incompetence or worse, fraud. They needed me to find the truth. I looked at the list of key personnel I would be interviewing and auditing. Mark's name was at the top, followed closely by Sarah. They had spent the previous night laughing at me for being a housewife with no real job, completely unaware that the board had just signed a contract that gave me the power to dismantle their careers. I felt a surge of cold professional satisfaction. I wasn't going into that office to seek revenge. I was going there to do exactly what I was paid for, to find the rot and cut it out. Mark had spent our entire relationship trying to keep me in his shadow, never realizing that the shadows are where the real power resides. He thought he was the architect of his own success, but he was about to learn that he had built his empire on a foundation I had already inspected and found lacking. The firm I built in the shadows was now being paid to expose the very man who thought I was nothing more than a shadow. The decision to accept the contract felt like a final decisive click of a puzzle piece falling into place. By Tuesday morning, the transition from the quiet woman in the shadow of the sterling gala to the lead auditor of an elite forensic firm was complete. I traded my navy silk for a charcoal power suit tailored with such precision that it felt less like clothing and more like armor. I tied my hair back into a sleek, uncompromising knot and stepped into the headquarters of Mark's company at exactly 9 o'clock. The change in the atmosphere was instantaneous. When I had visited Mark for lunch a month ago, the receptionist had barely looked up from her phone, making me wait 20 minutes before dismissively pointing me toward the elevators. Today, as I approached the mahogany desk with my high-level security clearance visible, she straightened her spine as if an electric current had passed through her. I didn't smile. I didn't have to. I simply stated my name and the firm I represented. Within seconds, a junior executive was scurrying toward me, offering to take my coat and asking if the temperature in the conference room was to my liking. I walked through the open-plan office with a measured, rhythmic pace that commanded the floor. I wasn't a guest, and I certainly wasn't a pretty accessory. I was a professional treating a failing corporation like a crime scene, and the staff seemed to sense that a reckoning had arrived. I was led toward the main boardroom where the heavy glass doors muffled the sounds of what was clearly a desperate high-stakes argument. Through the transparency, I could see Sarah standing at the head of the table, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and panic, while Mark sat to her right, rubbing his temples with the air of a man whose world was fraying at the edges. They were deep in a heated debate about the system crash, oblivious to the fact that their judge had arrived. When the junior executive opened the door and announced my presence, the silence that followed was so absolute it felt physical. The air seemed to leave the room. Sarah's mouth hung open, a half-formed insult likely still resting on her tongue, while Mark's hand froze mid-air. For a heartbeat, he looked at me with the same patronizing confusion he had shown at the gala, his brain struggling to reconcile the housewife he had left at breakfast with the formidable woman standing before him. He let out a nervous, forced chuckle and stood up, reaching out as if to usher me toward the exit. "Casey, what on earth are you doing here? This isn't the time for a surprise visit, honey. We're in the middle of a national crisis." I didn't move. I didn't even look at his outstretched hand. Before he could utter another condescending word, the senior vice president, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was legendary, stood up from the far end of the table and walked toward me with a look of immense relief. "Mark, sit down." The VP barked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "This is the lead auditor from the firm the board hired to save our lives." He turned to me and shook my hand with genuine deference. "We are honored to have you here. I've heard you're the only person who can find out why our system is hemorrhaging $10 million a day." The shift in Mark's eyes was a masterpiece of human emotion, a rapid descent from confusion to disbelief, and finally to a cold, stark terror. He slumped back into his leather chair, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he realized that the mushy brain he had mocked was now the only thing standing between him and professional ruin. Sarah looked as though she had been struck, her gaze darting between Mark and me, searching for the smug power she had wielded so easily just nights ago. I took my seat at the head of the table, opening my slim laptop and spreading my digital workspace across the massive central screen. I didn't acknowledge the gala. I didn't mention Sarah's sneers or Mark's calculated silence. Instead, I used my own silence as a tactical vacuum. I sat perfectly still, letting the quiet stretch until the discomfort in the room became unbearable. Sarah began to babble, her voice high and erratic as she tried to explain the unfixable errors in the software, her words tripping over themselves as she looked to me for some sign of empathy. I gave her nothing. I merely watched her, my expression unreadable as she and Mark stumbled through a series of technical lies that I already knew were false. Every time they paused, hoping for a lead or a hint of my findings, I simply looked down at my data and made a slow, deliberate note. To them, I was no longer a person they could bully or a woman they could ignore. I was the judge, an impartial force of nature that was about to strip away their facades. The more they spoke, the more they revealed their incompetence, their ego-driven mistakes laid bare by their own frantic attempts to hide them. Mark tried to meet my eyes, seeking the supportive fiancé he thought he owned, but he found only a stranger with the power to end his career. They were waiting for a housewife to leave the room. They didn't realize the expert they had been praying for was the woman they had spent all year laughing at. The tension in the boardroom was already at a breaking point when the real catastrophe began. As Sarah fumbled through another defensive explanation, the large monitor behind me suddenly flickered to a stark, terrifying red. Then, with a digital groan that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, the entire system went black. It wasn't my doing, I was merely an observer, but the timing was poetic. The cracks in the foundation of Mark's genius project had finally widened into a canyon. This was the inevitable result of months of reckless shortcuts, ignored warnings from his junior developers, and a culture of silence that Mark had carefully cultivated to ensure no one questioned his authority. The disaster wasn't a sudden act of fate, it was the cumulative weight of his own arrogance. As the office outside erupted into panicked shouting, I watched Mark's composure dissolve. He didn't look like a leader, he looked like a cornered animal. Instead of taking charge, he immediately turned on his lead developer, a young man who had been trying to warn him about these very vulnerabilities for weeks. "You told me the patch was stable," Mark hissed, his voice echoing in the stunned silence of the boardroom. "You've ruined us with your incompetence." It was a pathetic display of cowardice, shifting the blame onto a subordinate who lacked the power to fight back. In that moment, the senior VP's face hardened. He was finally seeing the man I had been living with for 5 years, a man who took all the credit for the sunshine, but threw everyone else under the bus the moment it started to rain. Mark's mask hadn't just slipped, it had shattered, alienating the very team he needed to survive this crisis. The vice president turned to me, his eyes wide with a mixture of desperation and expectation. "Casey, for God's sake, you're the expert here. You're practically family to Mark. Forget the audit for a moment, just fix it. Get us back online now and we can discuss the paperwork later." Mark looked at me then, a flicker of his old manipulative charm returning to his eyes. He actually had the audacity to nod as if we were back in our kitchen and he was asking me to handle a minor chore. "Please, honey," he whispered, "just do your thing and save the day." For a split second, the old Casey, the woman who had spent decades being the unpaid emotional and professional labor for everyone around her, wanted to jump in. I knew exactly which lines of code were failing and how to reroute the traffic to stabilize the core. But then I remembered the gala. I remembered the calculated smile he gave Sarah while she questioned my intelligence. I remembered that for years I had been the silent architect of his success, while he had been the one receiving the bonuses and the accolades. I looked the VP directly in the eye, my voice calm and professional. "I'm afraid that's impossible," I said. "My contract is for a forensic audit and an independent investigation, not for emergency repairs. To intervene now would compromise the integrity of my findings and violate my professional ethics. I am here to document the cause of the failure, not to be a free safety net for poor management decisions." The shock in the room was palpable. Mark's jaw dropped, his face turning an even deeper shade of crimson. He couldn't believe that I was refusing to play the role he had assigned me, the invisible fixer who made him look good. But I was done being the woman who cleaned up the messes of men who didn't respect her. I was a high-level consultant with a reputation to protect, and I wouldn't be bullied into providing free labor to save a man who had actively tried to diminish my worth. As the VP sputtered, trying to find a way to command me, Sarah suddenly stood up, her face twisted in a desperate attempt to prove she was still relevant. "I can do it!" she shouted, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "I know the protocol Mark set up." I watched with cold fascination as she began to override the system's safety triggers. She was hired for her loyalty to Mark, not for her skill, and it was about to become painfully obvious to everyone in the building. I didn't stop her. I didn't say a word as she pushed a series of quick fixes that I knew would only lead to a total database corruption. She was trying to be the hero, but she was only digging their collective grave. Within minutes, the server room down the hall began to scream as the cooling fans hit their maximum capacity, and then silence. The entire company's data was now locked in an unrecoverable spiral. Sarah stared at the screen, her hands shaking as the realization of her mistake dawned on her. She hadn't saved the company. She had ensured its total collapse. I sat back in my chair, my pen moving steadily across my notepad as I documented every frantic lie, every panicked command, and every failed line of code Sarah had just committed to the logs. I was building a dossier that would serve as the executioner's axe for their careers. I watched as the hierarchy they had built on a foundation of lies and ego began to crumble in real time. The VP was now on the phone with the board, his voice trembling as he explained that the situation had gone from critical to terminal. Mark was slumped in his chair, staring at the floor, finally realizing that he had no one left to blame. He had marginalized the talented people, promoted the loyal but incompetent ones, and alienated the only person who could have actually helped him. He had spent his entire career trying to look like the smartest person in the room by making sure everyone else felt small. But now in the dark, his smallness was the only thing left to see. I had spent my life building things that lasted, and I had spent the last 2 years building a firm that protected my value. I didn't have to sabotage them. I didn't have to write a single line of malicious code. I simply had to adhere to my professional standards and let the weight of their own dishonesty do the work for me. They had created a culture where the truth was a threat and competence was a secondary concern, and now that culture was devouring itself. I didn't have to break their world. I just had to step back and watch them drown in the mess they had created while trying to look like heroes. The silence following the system's total collapse was the most honest moment I had experienced in years. While the VP paced the hallway outside, barking into his phone about liability and insurance, I remained in the boardroom, my eyes fixed on the lines of raw code that had finally been forced into the light by Sarah's fatal override. I wasn't just looking for errors anymore. I was looking for a ghost. As I scrolled through the core architecture, the very foundation Mark claimed to have pioneered, my heart stopped. There, buried deep within the logic of the kernel, was a specific idiosyncratic way of handling memory allocation that I had developed nearly 6 years ago. It was a digital fingerprint, a unique handwriting in the code that only I used. I remember writing that logic on a rainy Tuesday in our old apartment back when I thought Mark was a partner who deserved my help. He had asked me to look at a side project he was struggling with, and I had stayed up all night sketching out the solution that would eventually become the backbone of this entire company. He hadn't just underestimated my intelligence, he had systematically stolen it. He had taken my intellectual property, rebranded it as his own genius invention, and used it to secure the very promotion that now allowed him to look down on me. The realization was sickening. He hadn't kept me small at home because he was old-fashioned or protective. He had done it because he was terrified. He was a fraud living in a house built on my stolen labor, and he knew that if I ever looked at his work with a professional eye, I would recognize my own mind staring back at him. Every time he suggested I stay home, every time he told Sarah I was happy where I was, he was protecting his lie. I closed my laptop with a quiet snap and walked toward Mark's private office. He was sitting behind his oversized mahogany desk, the shadows from the late afternoon sun stretching across his face like bars. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot, still trying to summon a shred of the bravado he had used to deceive me for so long. "Casey, look. I know today was a disaster, but we can fix this," he began, his voice trembling. "I'll talk to the board. I'll make sure they know you did your best." I didn't say a word until I was standing directly across from him. I didn't scream and I didn't cry. I simply leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool wood of his desk, and asked a single devastating question. "Did you really think I would never recognize my own handwriting in the code, Mark?" The color drained from his face so quickly, it was as if a plug had been pulled. He tried to speak, but only a dry rattling sound came out. "I know about the kernel." I continued my voice, a calm, steady blade. "I know about the memory allocation logic I wrote for you 5 years ago. You didn't just let Sarah insult me at that gala. You were counting on her to do it. You needed me to believe I was irrelevant so I would never ask to see what you were working on." His defense was as pathetic as it was predictable. "Casey, you don't understand. I did it for us," he stammered, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "I needed that promotion to give us the life you deserved. I was going to tell you once we were married and things were stable. It was a side project we worked on together, remember? The ultimate betrayal wasn't just the theft of my work. It was the way he tried to repackage it as a romantic gesture. He didn't want a wife to walk beside him. He wanted a silent partner he could rob of both her dignity and her ideas. He saw my talent as a resource to be harvested, a hidden well he could draw from while pretending to be the one who brought the water. He had looked me in the eye every morning for years, knowing that his entire career was a stolen fragment of my identity. He had been a parasite disguised as a provider, and the person I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life with didn't actually exist. He was a hollow shell, a ghost built on my stolen labor. In that moment of crushing clarity, the emotional climax wasn't the anger I felt toward him. It was the realization of what I had allowed to happen to myself. My invisibility wasn't just his doing. I had been an accomplice in my own erasure. I had believed his lies because they were comfortable, and I had dimmed my own light to make sure he never felt like he was in the shade. I had been the silent architect of his life, providing the stability and the genius he lacked, all while letting him convince me that I was the one who was lucky to have him. I saw the systematic way he had tried to bury me, and I realized that my silence hadn't been a virtue. It had been a sanctuary for a thief. The man standing before me was nothing more than a shadow of my own making, and the power he held over me was an illusion I was finally ready to break. He didn't just want me to stay home, he wanted me to stay dead so his lie could live. But ghosts don't write code, I do. The professional fallout was as clinical as it was swift. When I presented my final audit to the board of directors the following morning, I didn't need to raise my voice or lean into personal grievances to make my point. I sat in that same boardroom now, illuminated by the harsh, honest light of a new day, and laid out the forensic evidence with the detached precision of a surgeon. I didn't mention the gala, the insults, or the broken engagement. Those were domestic dramas that had no place in a criminal investigation. Instead, I focused on the digital reality. I provided irrefutable proof of the plagiarized code showing the original timestamps of my own work from years prior, and highlighting the reckless modifications Mark had made to hide the theft modifications that had directly caused the system's fatal instability. The reaction from the board was a mixture of outrage and profound embarrassment. Mark was stripped of his title and his security clearance before the meeting had even concluded, with the company's legal counsel already drafting a massive lawsuit for professional fraud and intellectual property theft. Sarah, whose panicked attempts to fix the crisis had resulted in permanent database corruption, was demoted and placed under internal review for her role in the cover-up. The karma wasn't flashy or loud. It was the quiet, undeniable weight of truth crushing a structure built on lies. No one was laughing anymore. The people who had spent the year treating me like an invisible accessory were now scrambling to distance themselves from the radioactive wreckage of Mark's career. The clean exit I made was perhaps the most empowering moment of my life. I didn't wait for the apologies that I knew were coming, the desperate groveling emails and the late-night phone calls where Mark would inevitably try to claim he was the victim of circumstance. I returned to our house while he was still at the office being interrogated by the legal team. I didn't pack in anger. I packed with a sense of profound relief, as if I were finally shedding a skin that had never quite fit. When I was done, I walked into his study and placed the 3-carat diamond engagement ring on his desk. Next to it, I laid a formal, itemized invoice from my consulting firm for 48 hours of high-level forensic auditing at my full corporate rate. It was a business transaction, a clear signal that the era of my unpaid labor and emotional subsidizing was officially over. I didn't seek revenge through a dramatic confrontation or a public scene. I sought justice through the simple act of reclaiming my value and walking away with my self-respect intact. As I drove away from the house and the life I had almost allowed to consume me, I felt a lightness I hadn't known in decades. I wasn't just leaving a man. I was leaving the version of myself that believed she had to be small to be loved. I moved into a sun-drenched apartment downtown, a place that was entirely mine, and focused on the expansion of the firm I had built in the shadows. 6 months later, I stood backstage at a major international technology summit, listening to the muffled roar of thousands of attendees in the auditorium. I was no longer the woman hiding in a craft room, or the fiancé waiting for a crumb of acknowledgement at a corporate gala. When the moderator introduced me as the keynote speaker and a premier authority in global systems architecture, the applause was deafening. I walked onto that stage with my head held high, wearing my success not as a shield, but as a testament to the fact that talent and integrity eventually find their way to the light. I looked out at the audience, seeing faces of all ages, including women who had been told their entire lives to wait their turn or stay in the background. My closing thought to them was one that had been forged in the fire of my own betrayal. Strength isn't about shouting louder than the people who doubt you. It's about being so good at what you do that your silence becomes their loudest problem. I had realized that my worth was never something that could be given to me by a man or a title. It was something I carried within me all along, even when I chose not to show it. The world had tried to convince me that I was a shadow, but in the end, it was my light that revealed the fraud and my competence that survived the storm. I finished my speech and walked off the stage into a future I had designed myself, a future where I would never again have to explain why I deserved a seat at the table. I walked off the stage and into a future I had designed for myself, a future where I would never again have to explain why I deserved a seat at the table. My journey from the quiet woman mocked at a gala to the leader standing in the spotlight proves that your value is not a gift others give you, it is a truth you define. If Casey's story moved you or reminded you of your own untapped power, please consider subscribing to the channel so you never miss another story of resilience and justice. We love hearing from our community, and your perspective is what makes this channel grow. Do you think Casey was right to walk away so coldly? Or would you have demanded an even bigger public confrontation with Mark? Perhaps you've been the secret power behind someone else's success and finally decided to claim your own credit. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, because your voice helps inspire others to stand tall. Have you ever been the secret power behind someone else's success until the day you decided to take that power back for yourself?